Hello, I'm Roberta Winters, President of the League of Women Voters of Radnor Township. I'm here today via Zoom during this COVID pandemic to talk to you about charter schools. This topic is just one of the many educational matters that the League has studied. Some of you may be aware that the Radnor Township School District recently heard an application for a Valley Forge military charter school. You can actually view that presentation that was held on March 24th on demand at our school district website, rtsd.org. It's a little more than an hour, but really well worth seeing. Now, to help us understand more about charter schools and their impact, I have with me today Larry Feinberg. He has been involved with educational matters locally and across the Commonwealth for many years. Welcome, Larry, to Mainline Television. Would you take a moment and share with us a bit about yourself for our audience?
Thanks, Roberta. It's nice to be here. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for having me. I'm in my 22nd year as a school board director in Haverford Township, just down the road from Radnor. For the past 4 years or so, I've been the president of the Haverford board. I've also been pretty active as a legislative liaison, working with both our state and federal legislators. For many years, I've served as chairman, and I now co-chair the Delaware County School Board's Legislative Council. That group has a representative from each of the 15 districts in Delaware County, and we try and work collectively with our legislators for the benefit of all of our school districts. I also served for about 7 years on the Board of Governors of the Pennsylvania School Boards Association, and I've been active with the National School Boards Association in public education advocacy. So it's been good work. I've enjoyed it, and that brings me here today.
Well, Larry, I can tell you're very busy, and that means you know a lot and you're dependable to tell us just what is a charter school, Larry.
A charter school is a public school that operates independently of the school district. It is established by a vote of the board of directors of a school district, and ostensibly operates with less regulation. I guess the short version is their charters are publicly financed and privately managed.
Well, are there benefits of charter schools that, if you say, are publicly financed and privately managed?
Under the law that established charter schools, there's a list of benefits that they hope to see, and if you don't mind me just reading for a moment, I'll give you those bullets.
Oh, please do. We need to know what's expected.
Number one is to improve student learning. Number two, to increase learning opportunities for all pupils, to encourage the use of different and innovative teaching methods, to create new professional opportunities for teachers, including the opportunity to be responsible for the learning program at the school site, to provide parents and pupils with expanded choices in the types of educational opportunities that are available within the public school system, and to hold the schools established under the charter school law accountable for meeting measurable academic standards and provide the school with a method to establish accountability systems. So that was the intent. I think that the initial law also talks about charters being laboratories of innovation, that would share successful practices and techniques with all public schools.
Well, I think those kinds of benefits are something that many of us in the Commonwealth would endorse. But I know there's been a lot of contention across Pennsylvania surrounding charter schools. And so given their lofty goals, can you take a moment and give us a brief overview of how these issues may have evolved over recent years?
I think there's about 187 charter schools in the state right now. The vast majority of those are located in Philadelphia. Additionally, a few years after the charter law was passed, it was updated to recognize the existence of cyber charter schools. And whereas there aren't that many brick and mortar charters throughout the state, every one of our 500 school districts is impacted by the cyber charters. And two main issues. One is the accountability for student performance, and the second is accountability for how public tax dollars are spent. I think that by the very nature of the way that the process is set up, there's a sort of an inherent struggle over funding, especially since the majority of students who are drawn to charters are coming from our school districts that have chronically been the most underfunded for years. So,
well, I believe there's some issues that I've heard a great deal about regarding the charter schools, and one of them is the criteria and rationale used for their adoption. And since Radnor is at the moment looking at in requests for a charter school, can you help us as the public understand how this rationale and criteria work?
Again, according to the Department of Education, citing the charter school law, it requires that the charter school be accountable to parents, the public, and the Commonwealth, with a delineation of that accountability clearly reflected in the charter. It requires a charter applicant at a minimum to demonstrate how the proposed charter school will provide a comprehensive learning experience to students and how it will serve as a model for other public schools. Additionally, a charter applicant must demonstrate that it has sustainable support from teachers, parents, other community members, and students to be granted a charter, and that there will be strategies for meaningful parent and community involvement. Charter must also be operated by a nonprofit entity governed by a board of trustees, and there must be a clear description of the method of how those trustees are appointed or elected. So that's the short version.
Wow, that's a lot to expect in order to get an adoption of a charter school. And I'm sure there's a lot of negotiations involved in that. Is there, Larry?
Well, I know that the charter applications that I've seen are, I wish I could hold up an application so people could see. It's thousands of pages, literally. We had a charter application about 15 years ago that was a joint application to Haverford and Upper Darby, and the stack of documents was this high.
Oh my goodness!
And I did watch the initial hearing that the Radnor School Board held a couple of weeks ago. And you're looking at similar material that has to be carefully evaluated by the board and the administration.
And I think many times there are lawyers involved in looking over these materials as well. Is that not the case?
Yeah, there always are.
Well, I know in addition to the review prior to adoption and the negotiations that goes on to make sure that they're in fact complying with the law, accountability is another concern I've heard raised, both in terms of the programs offered by charter schools and the achievements of students who are enrolled in them. And I know accountability was part of the original law and the criteria that you read earlier. So can you provide some insight into what this accountability question is all about?
If you look at academic performance and the way that the state measures academic performance is primarily through standardized testing, the PSSAs, Keystone exams, graduation rates. After 23 years of charter schools, I think it's fair to say that there's not a significant difference in performance for, if you look at the brick and mortars versus the regular public schools. However, in the cyber charter sector, it's stark what the difference is. The cyber charters, by the measures that I just mentioned, have been underperforming year after year after year and continue to do so.
Well, I guess with most every educational concern, whether it's the cyber charters or the brick and mortar charters, there's always the bottom line of money. So just how does that funding flow into the charter schools?
It's interesting. Each of the 500 districts, fills out a worksheet every year that lists their expenses and then takes some deductions for some of the kinds of things that the charter is not responsible for. So it may be transportation, for instance, is an expense that the school districts bear. School districts are required to provide transportation to charter students, but the charter school doesn't have that as their own expense. So there's a number of items like that are deducted, and then you divide by the number of students, and you come up with 2 charter school tuition rates for each school district. One is for regular education students, and the other is for special education students. So if you and I were standing in line at the supermarket and we were both buying the same thing, you'd pay a different rate than I would because Radnor's tuition rate's higher. We happen to be located in a sweet spot, the main line. If you look at Radnor, Lower Merion, Tredyffrin, Easttown, those are 3 of the wealthiest school districts in the state, and they're surrounded by a number of other fairly well-off school districts. So the charter tuition rates are quite high in this neck of the woods. In terms of accountability for the money, I think that's been a point of contention since the get-go. If you're interested in school district finances, you have many avenues to explore. Members of the public are entitled to go to the business office and ask to see anything. It's public information, check registers, budgets, where we go through a budget dance every year that essentially starts as soon as we put the last budget to bed, where we have at least 4 or 5 public discussions about our budgets. Our budgets are posted on our websites. Our meetings are public meetings, and they're at this point, I think almost all school districts stream or broadcast their meetings. So there's a great deal of transparency on the fiscal side. It's not quite that straightforward in the charter sector. You rarely, if ever, see press coverage of charter school board meetings. You just don't see the budgets, and you don't see the check registers. Some charter schools are managed, although the charter is a nonprofit. Some charter schools contract with for-profit management companies to provide a wide range of services. In some cases, soup to nuts, all services. And their books are completely unavailable. The largest brick and mortar charter in the state is the Chester Community Charter School. It was started in 1998, and we know virtually nothing about the dollar side of the operations there. None of it's public, and it's not subject to Pennsylvania right to know laws, whereas school districts certainly are subject to right to know laws. So
That certainly seems like a black hole, Larry, something that perhaps need to be addressed more fully.
I think, the school districts have been trying to encourage the legislature to enact charter reform that would foster more accountability and transparency for 20 years to no avail. Back in 2007, I testified before the Pennsylvania House Education Committee on cyber charter funding and accountability, and all the issues are just like they were in 2007. Nothing has changed. At that point, relatively early on in the cyber charter arena, the largest cyber charter in the state was started by a visionary, former school superintendent out in the town of Midland, Pennsylvania. It was a steel town that had shut down, lost a lot of jobs, and they were sending kids to Ohio across the border for education. And he came up with, he started the first cyber charter in the state, and he was a visionary. But a couple years later, he had accumulated so much of a fund balance that they were able to spend $10 million to finance a performing arts center for the town of Midland. And that's great for the town of Midland, but school districts all over the state paid for it.
Right.
So there's been I think a continuing struggle over what's reasonable funding wise, and that's focused on two areas. One certainly is the cyber charter tuition rates, because unlike a brick and mortar that draws from a geographical area, cyber charters, anybody in the state can attend any cyber charter. The second area is special education funding. A few years ago, there was a special ed funding commission established by the legislature, and they came back with a recommendation that special ed funding should be split into 3 different tiers that would recognize that special ed students have differing needs based on whatever qualifies them as special ed. So for instance, a student who might need a little bit of speech therapy, would be reimbursed at a lower rate, whereas a student that has multiple disabilities, who perhaps is wheelchair bound, who needs nursing assistant, is reimbursed at a much higher rate. And that 3-tiered special ed formula was implemented for school districts a number of years ago, but because of pressure by the charter school owners and lobbyists, it was never applied to the charter sector. And a few years back, the Pennsylvania Auditor General did a study that I think showed that districts were overpaying by about $200 million a year for special education services. So the way that formula works right now, if Radnor has a student, who needs speech therapy, maybe that costs an extra, I don't know, $1,000 or $2,000 a year. But if that student's in a charter school, instead of the charter tuition being $13,000 or $15,000. It can be $35,000 or $40,000. So that's a huge issue, and there's been a lot of attention in trying to get that changed.
Well, I know there have been a couple of resolutions that you've asked school districts to pass regarding charter schools. And do those advocate those two issues, the charter school issue, that's a cyber charter, and also the special ed issue?
Yeah, let me just give you an update on the resolutions. Right now, 393 out of the 500 school districts have school boards that have passed resolutions calling for charter school funding reform. And the primary focus is on the special ed formula that we just spoke about. The tuition rates can vary hugely, I don't have the PDE hasn't released the latest figures, but what the last data set they have is 2018, 2019, and in that year, total charter school tuition payments, which is brick and mortar and cybers, were more than $2 billion, which is not peanuts.
No, that's
and over 600 million of that was for cyber charter tuition.
so.
Those resolutions pretty much focus on the special ed funding. So that's very significant.
You've got that right. Now, if you were a member of the public in Radnor, like I was, or other municipality of the Commonwealth, and you had an application coming in for a charter school, what questions would you ask to help people understand what's going on?
I think if you look at what the list of goals for charters were when the law was passed, and try and apply them to Radnor's situation and this application from Valley Forge Military Academy. Again, is it going to improve learning? Is it going to increase opportunities? Is it going to encourage innovative teaching models? So looking at it through that lens, I think is very important. Will it provide choices, expanded choices for parents and pupils? I just want to make it clear. I don't want people to misunderstand my position here. We firmly support parents and students' right to choose. And I want to underline that. As long as those choices, the schools, the charter schools, are held to the same kind of accountability and transparency that our regular public schools are. With Valley Forge, it's interesting, and we've had a history of charter schools. If you look at where the brick and mortar charter schools are, they're primarily in struggling school districts. Chester, Upland, certainly, Philly, and there are school districts that have a lot of funding issues. In Radnor's case, you're about the furthest thing you could be from a struggling school district, both in terms of performance and funding. I don't know if folks saw, about a year ago, there was an article in the Inquirer about Valley Forge and the struggles that their board was going through because their enrollment has been dropping for several years, and there seemed to be concerns about their fiscal viability. So here we have what I guess you could characterize as a struggling private institution, and that seems to be the impetus for the current situation in Radnor.
Well, I want to thank you, Larry, for coming today, because both of us have been involved in education for a long time, when we all realized that one size does not fit all when it comes to meeting the needs of learners. And choice, as you mentioned, is an important thing. And while we encourage innovative programs, we also want to make sure, as you stressed, that they're accountable and that we can monitor and assess their effectiveness. And part of that is also through that increased transparency that you mentioned. We all want to make sure we don't rob Peter to pay Paul, and sometimes that seems to be happening. Every child should have access to quality education. I think that's something we all embrace. And funding is a challenge both places, both practically and politically in Pennsylvania. So on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Radnor, I want to thank you, Larry, for joining us today. And for those of you who would like to keep up with what is happening in public education relative to charter schools across Pennsylvania, I encourage you to sign up for Larry's daily updates by Googling PA Charter Change Roundup. You'll be glad you did. As always, we are most grateful to Mainline Television for hosting our programs such as this to keep the public informed so that they might fully participate in governmental issues at the state, local, and national levels. We are also most appreciative of you, our audience, for tuning in and hopefully following up on issues surrounding charter schools here and across the Commonwealth. We hope you'll stay informed and participate as needed to help make our democracy work. The League of Women Voters welcomes such involvement, and thank you for tuning in. Bye now.
Thanks again.